This video is basically a tutorial that will go into depth about the different parts of the heart. And so here we have a sheep's heart. And so I'm going to start off by defining what's the left and right side, posterior, anterior sides. So this is the anterior side of the heart. And then if we flip it around, this will be the posterior side. The superior part is basically the upper half of the heart, so this part and above is the superior part, and then inferior means the lower part of the heart. A sagittal cut would be a lengthwise or vertical cut that divides the body into left and right portions. So in other words, a sagittal cut would be a cut that's just going vertically down. I can't do it manually, but it would be like that. A frontal cut is what divides the body into the anterior and posterior portions. So the frontal part would be a cut like this. Basically, if you see it, a cut that goes down like that is a frontal cut. And a transverse cut is a horizontal cut like that divides the body into the superior and inferior parts. And the oblique cut is any diagonal section of the heart. And so let's start off with what kind of things protect the heart. So there is something called the pericardium, which is basically a very thick membranous sac that surrounds and protects the heart and secures it in its place in the body. Right now we do not have the pericardium. It has been removed, but you would usually, if you were to pull in the pericardium, it would be extremely thick and very hard to pull apart, so that's why, hence it's very good at supporting the heart. Next we have heart. Muscle is consisted of 3 layers. The first being the epicardium, and then the myocardium, and then the endocardium. So inside the pericardium, there is something called the epicardium, which is the same thing as visceral pericardium, and it is what lines the outer portion of the heart wall. And then if we look inside the heart, this very thick layer of muscle that we see here, this thick layer here, that is a myocardium, and it is the most important cardiac muscle because it is what helps the heart to contract. And then the last layer of the heart muscle is the endocardium, which is right above here, that little white portion there. And the endocardium is what lines the chambers of the heart. And so now going into what the chambers of the heart are, there are 4 chambers. The upper chambers are called atria, and the lower ones are called ventricles. So you can always tell which one's the left side and the right side of the heart by determining which muscle is thicker. So on the left side of the heart, you're going to find thicker and bigger portions of muscle. So because this side is clearly has thicker muscles than the right side, we can define this place to be the left side of the heart, while this is the right side. So starting here, this would be the left ventricle of the heart. This would be the right ventricle. And then, though the heart is technically cut in half, so this is the other half of the the right ventricle, and the other half of the left ventricle. But behind the ventricles up here, you will have the right atria sitting on top of that right ventricle, and on this side you would have the left atria sitting on top of that left ventricle. So now that I've talked about the 4 chambers of the heart and where they're located, I'll talk about how exactly they function. So we have 4 main types of valves. The atrioventricular valves are divided into the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve, and the semilunar valves are divided into the pulmonary valves and the aortic valve. So the tricuspid valve is between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and it has 3 cusps with pointed ends that project into the ventricle. And so your tricuspid valve would be located here, while the bicuspid valve is between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And opposite the tricuspid, it has 2 cusps that work the same way as the cusps of a tricuspid valve, so it would be located here. We also have semilunar valves, which are the pulmonary valve and aortic valves. And so the pulmonary valve is at the opening where the pulmonary trunk leaves the right ventricle. So over here is your pulmonary trunk. That's the opening. This is the pulmonary trunk. You would normally see a pulmonary artery. However, the artery was cut off when the heart was being cut out of the sheep. So you don't see a pulmonary artery here, but this is the pulmonary trunk. And so once again, the pulmonary valve is at the opening where the pulmonary trunk leaves the right ventricle. So that would be at the tip right there. Let me get a little. So this is, once again, it's where the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk would meet, so it'd be right there. And then the aortic valve is at the opening between the left ventricle and the aorta, which is up there. And then moving on, so now we have things called chordae tendineae, and these are tendon-like cords that connect the pointed ends of the valves to the papillary muscles. So these thick, sorry, not these thick, but I should say these white little lines of muscle you see right here, those are the chordae tendineae, and those prevent the valve cusps from pushing up into the atria when the ventricles contract. And so these chordae tendineae actually connect to something called the papillary muscles, which are cardiac muscle projections on the inner surface of ventricles. So the chordae tendineae connect to the papillary muscles, which are lined against the right ventricle and the left ventricles. So, like there. Okay, so now that we've talked about the valves and that, we are going to go talk about like arteries and veins and the septum. So over here, the septum is basically a layer that divides the atrium from the ventricles. And so this thick thing, like right here, this little thick line there, that is going to be your interventricular septum. And the atrioventricular septum is what divides the right atrium from the left ventricle. Next, we have the coronary sinus, which is what drains blood from most of the vessels that supply the heart wall. And so the coronary sinus is actually a very thick vein, and it would be located on the side of the left atrium, so at the top of the left atrium. However, because this heart's, the veins were cut off, you can't see the coronary sinus, but in reality, it would be there. So now let's go on to the outside surface of the heart. So we see, you can see these two things right here. And so these are actually the coronary arteries. Well, they would be arteries. The arteries would usually stem off and branch up into the other parts of the body. But in essence, these coronary arteries branch off from the ascending aorta, which is this structure right here. And the coronary veins would bring blood back to the heart. However, they're cut off here, just like the coronary arteries were cut off from the heart. Structures called auricles, which are ear-like structures. They look like flaps here, so I can't really move it that much because there's a lot of fat, as you can see, surrounding the heart. But you have two auricles, so one here, and then another one would be this. So you can see how it's like really flappy. And so the auricles are very important because they help increase the capacity, the blood volume capacity of the chambers of the atrium. So they sit right on top of the atrium in order to allow more blood to diffuse there. And so now we have the pulmonary vein. So like I mentioned earlier, the pulmonary trunk is located right over here, and blood would go through the pulmonary trunk, which is this guy over here. Blood would go out through the pulmonary trunk and go out through the pulmonary arteries, and then this hole right here, which is located right behind this auricle, if I put my probe through this, we can see, we can see that the pulmonary vein would carry blood back into the heart. And it would go through the left atria into the left ventricles. So that would be your pulmonary vein. Next we have the inferior and the superior vena cavas. And so the superior vena cava is what, well actually I should say both the superior and inferior vena cavas, they both bring back blood from the body. So the heart would collect blood from the upper part of the body, which would be from the superior vena cava, while the inferior vena cava brings blood from the lower part, like the legs, for example, those parts of the body. And so your superior vena cava and your inferior vena cava sort of form an X when they cross each other, when they intersect. And so your superior vena cava would be over here. And your inferior vena cava would be this little outer portion there. Usually they would, it's kind of cut off once again, but that's where you would see your superior and inferior vena cava. I want to quickly go through the electrical system of the heart. So we start off with the SA node, which basically starts each heartbeat and sets the pace for the whole heart. So the SA node would be located at the top of the right atrium, and then that signal would travel to the AV node, and so the AV node is located towards the bottom of the right atrium. So the impulses move from the SA node to the AV node, which makes the atria contract. And at the AV node, the impulse is delayed in order for the atria to completely contract and move blood into the ventricles. And the impulses rapidly go through something called the AV bundle, which is like this little, you can't see it here, but from the right atrium, it goes down through this AV bundle and into the right and left bundle branches, which then travel down into the Purkinje fibers. And the Purkinje fibers are really important because they're what cause, the Purkinje fibers essentially, they contract for the electrical impulse to go back up throughout the heart. So it's kind of like the electrical impulse starts, it goes to the bottom of the heart, to the apex, and then it goes all the way back to the top for when the Purkinje fibers allow the entire heart to contract. Last but not least, the cardiac cycle is established into 3 different stages. So there's the atrial systole, ventricular systole, and relaxation period. So atrial systole is when the SA node causes the atria to contract and the ventricles relax. The ventricular systole is when the ventricles contract and the atria relax. And the relaxation period is the repolarization of ventricular muscle fibers, and the repolarization of, it is when the ventricles and atria relax. So the lub-dub, there's something called a lub-dub sound when you hear the heart contract. And so the lub is what is caused when the AV valves close after ventricle systole begins. And the dub sound that you hear is the semilunar valves closing at the end of ventricular systole. And there's also a pause during the relaxation period. So that is the lub-dub sound that you hear. And that concludes the cardiac cycle. So I hope you learned a lot from this video.